Hello again. I had a technical issue here. Um, this is chapter 13 of The Invisible Rainbow by author Firstenberg, actually on the 13th day of September 2024. The chapter is simply called Cancer and the Starvation of Life. And let me do something else here. Make it a little bit easier for me to read. So, at the commencement of the 20th century, the great problem of the causation of tumors, like a giant sphinx, looms large on the medical horizon. We've got a real issue here, folks, in other words. W. Roger Williams, fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in England, 1908, stated on February 24, 2011, the Italy Supreme Court upheld the criminal conviction of Cardinal Roberto Tucci, former president of Vatican Radio Management Committee, for creating a public nuisance by polluting the environment with radio waves. The Vatican broadcasts to the world, transmitted in 40 languages, emanated from 48 powerful radio towers occupying over 1,000 acres of land surrounded by suburban communities. And for decades, residents in those communities have been screaming that the transmissions were destroying their health as well as causing an epidemic of childhood leukemia. At the request of the public prosecutor office in Rome, which was considering bringing charges against the Vatican for negligent homicide, Judge Zara Sacchia ordered an official investigated by the National Cancer Institute in Milan. Results released November 13, 2010, was shocking. Between 1997 and 2003, so we're talking about 6 years, children aged 1 to 14 who live between 6 and 12 kilometers, which is roughly 3.7 to 7.5 miles from Vatican Radio antenna farm, developed leukemia. Okay? Lymphoma, myeloma at 8 times the rate of children who live further away. What else could it be, folks? And I can guarantee you what this is all about. This is about shortwave radio. And probably could be also AM radio, also at enormous power. Depends on what type of transmitters they have. They can transmit 250,000 watts. Okay. And anyone living in that area is what it's saying here is actually there is an early death for children. And adults who live between 6 and 12 kilometers from the antennas died of leukemia at almost 7 times the rate of adults who live further away. Okay? And they show a picture of it, the antenna farms, as it calls it. So you have a major, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 antennas that are up in the air. Probably, the tallest one's probably 500 feet or 1,000 feet up in the sky. Okay? The third disease association that Samuel Milham related to the electrification is cancer. At first blush, it is not obvious what the connection is. Impaired metabolism of sugar is surely connected to diabetes, and impaired metabolism of fats to heart disease. But how does cancer fit in? The key was provided by a scientist who studied C. urchin, urchin, eggs in his laboratory over 100 years ago. He was a native of the same city where a century later, 3,000 doctors were to sign an appeal to world stating, among other things, that radio waves cause leukemia. On October 8, 1883, a son was born to Emma Warburg, a prominent Jewish physician in Freiburg, Germany. When he was 13, the family moved to Berlin, where visitors to his parents' home included some of the giants of the natural science. In Maine, chemist Emma Fischer, physical chemist Walter Nurse, Nernst, physiologist Theodor Wilhelm Ingelmann, I should say. Later, when Albert Einstein moved to Berlin, the great scientist used to come over to play chamber music with his father, Einstein on violin and Emmett Warburg on piano. No one was surprised when young Otto, growing up in such an atmosphere, enrolled at the University of Freiburg to study chemistry. But by the time he reached his PhD in 1906, a growing disease epidemic had caught the attention of this ambitious young man. His was the first generation seriously to be affected by it. Cancer rates all over Europe had doubled since he was born, and he was determined to devote his life to finding the reason and hopefully a cure. With this in mind, he returned to school, receiving his MD from the University of Heidelberg, I should say, in 1911. So that's 5 years later. What fundamentally changed, he wondered, takes place in the tissue when a normal cell becomes cancerous. Quote, does the metabolism of tumors, end quote, he asked, quote, growing in a disorganized manner, different from the metabolism of ordinary cells growing at the same rate, end quote. Impressed that both tumors and early embryons consisted of undifferential cells that multiplied rapidly, Otto Warburg began his life work by studying fertilized eggs. Perhaps he speculated cancer cells are just normal cells that have reverted to an embryonic pattern of growth. He chose the sea urchin egg to study because its embryo is large and grows particularly fast. His first major work, published while he was still in medical school, showed that on fertilization, the rate of oxygen consumption of an egg rises sixfold. But in 1908, he could pursue his ambition no further because the chemical reaction within the cells that involved oxygen were completely unknown. Spectrophotometry, the identity of chemicals from the frequency of light they absorb, was new and had not yet been applied to living systems. Existing techniques for culturing cells and measuring gas exchange were primitive. Warburg realized that before any real progress could be made in elucidating the metabolism of cancer, fundamentally research on the metabolism of normal cells would have to be done. Cancer research would have to wait. During the coming years, with a break during which he served in the World War, Warburg, using techniques that he developed, proved that the respiration of cell took place in the tiny structures that he called grana, G-R-A-N-A, end quote, and that we now call mitochondria. He experienced with the effects of alcohols, cyanide, and other chemicals on respiration, and concluded that the enzymes in the grana must contain a heavy metal that he suspected and later proved was iron. He conducted landmark experiments using spectrophotometry that proved that the portion of the enzyme that reacts with oxygen in the cell is identical with the portion of hemoglobin that binds oxygen in the blood. That chemical called Heme, H-E-M-E, is a porphyrin bonded to iron, and the enzyme containing it, which exists in every cell and makes breathing possible, is known today as cytochrome oxidase. For this work, Warburg was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1931. Meanwhile, in 1923, Warburg resumed his research on cancer, picking up where he had left off 15 years earlier. The starting point, end quote, he wrote, quote, has been the fact that the respiration of sea urchin eggs increased sixfold at the moment of fertilization, end quote, i.e., at the moment that it changes from a state of rest to a state of growth. He expected to find a similar increase of respiration in cancer cells, but to his amazement, he found just the opposite. The rat tumor he was working with used considerably less oxygen than normal tissues from healthy rats. Quote, this result seemed so startling, end quote, he wrote, quote, that the assumption seemed justified that the tumor lacked suitable material for combustion, end quote. So Warburg added various nutrients to the cultural medium, still expecting to see a dramatic rise in oxygen use. Instead, when he added glucose, the tumor respiration ceased completely. And in trying to discover why this happened, he found that tremendous amount of lactic acid were accumulating in the cultural medium. The tumor, in fact, was producing fully 12% of its weight in lactic acid per hour. Per unit time, it was producing 124 times as much lactic acid as blood, 200 times as much as a frog's muscle at rest, 8 times as much as a frog's muscle working to the limit of its capacity. The tumor was consuming the glucose all right, but it was not making use of oxygen to do it. In additional experiments on other types of cancer in animals and humans, Warburg found that this was generally true of all cancer cells and of no normal cells. That's a red flag, folks. Okay. So what he's pointing out here is it was not using any oxygen. It was growing, consuming the glucose. Okay. Which is sugar, partly sugar. Warburg found that this was generally true of all cancer cells and of no normal cells. So this was indifferent. This singular fact impressed Warburg as of the utmost importance of the key to the causation of this disease. The extraction of energy from glucose without using oxygen, a type of metabolism called anaerobia glycolysis, also called fermentation, is a highly inefficient process that takes place to a small extent in most living cells, but only becomes important when not enough oxygen is available. For example, runners during a sprint push their muscles to use energy faster than their lungs can deliver oxygen to them. Their muscles temporarily produce energy anaerobia without oxygen, incurring an oxygen debt that is repaid when they end their sprint and stop to gulp air, which you've seen that. Although capable of supplying energy rapidly in emergency, anaerobia glycolysis produces much less energy for the same amount of glucose and deposits lactic acid in the tissues that has to be disposed of. Fermentation is a very old form of metabolism from which all forms of life obtained their energy for billions of years. Before green plants appeared on Earth and filled the atmosphere with oxygen, some primitive forms of life today, many bacteria and yeasts, for example, still rely on it, but all complex organisms have abandoned that way of making a living. What Warburg discovered in 1923 is that cancer cells differ from normal cells in all higher organisms. It's this fundamental respect. They maintain high rates of anaerobia glycolysis and produce large amounts of lactic acid even in the presence of oxygen. This discovery called the Warburg effect is the basis for the diagnosis and staging of cancer today. Using physician emission tomography or PET scanning because anaerobia glycolysis is inefficient and consumes glucose at a tremendous rate. PET scans can easily find tumors in the body by the more rapid uptake of radioactive glucose. And the more malignant the tumor, the more rapidly it takes up glucose. Warburg reasonably believed he had discovered the cause of cancer. Evidently, in cancer, the respiratory mechanism had been damaged and has lost control over its metabolism of the cell. Unrestrained glycolysis and unrestrained growth are the result. In the absence of normal metabolic control, the cell reverts to a more primitive state. All complex organisms, proposed Warburg, must have oxygen in order to maintain their highly differential forms. Without oxygen, they will revert to a more undifferential, simple form of growth, such as existing exclusively on this planet before there was oxygen in the air. The causation factor in the origin of tumors, end quote, proposed Warburg, quote, is nothing other than oxygen deficiency, end quote. When cells are deprived of oxygen only temporarily, glycolysis takes over during the emergency, but ceases again when oxygen is once more available. But when cells are repeatedly or chronically deprived of oxygen, he said, respiratory control is eventually damaged and glycolysis becomes independent. Quote, if respiration of a growing cell is disturbed, end quote, wrote Warburg in 1930, quote, as a rule, the cell dies. If it does not die, a tumor cell results, end quote. So Warburg's hypothesis was first brought to my attention in the mid-1990s by Dr. John Holt, H-O-L-T, a colorful figure in Australia who was treating cancer with microwave radiation and who wanted and who warned his colleagues that the same radiation could convert normal cells into cancerous ones. I didn't fully understand the connection of Warburg's work on cancer to my work on electricity, so I filed away the research papers Holt sent me for future reference. Today, with so many more pieces of the puzzle in place, the connection is obvious. Electricity, like rain on a campfire, dampens the flames of combustion in flames of combustion in living cells. So if Warburg was correct and chronic lack of oxygen caused cancer, then one need look no further than electrification for the origin of the modern pandemic. Warburg's theory was controversial from the beginning. Hundreds of different kinds of cancers were known in the 1920s, triggered by thousands of kinds of chemicals and physical agents. Many scientists were reluctant to believe in a common cause that was so simple. Warburg answered them with a simple explanation. Each of those thousands of chemicals and agents, in its own way, starve cells of oxygen. Arsenic, he explained by way of example, is a respiratory poison that causes cancer. Urethane is a narcotic that inhibits respiratory and causes cancer. When you implant a foreign object under the skin, it causes cancer because it blocks blood circulation, starving neighboring tissues of oxygen. Although they didn't necessarily accept Warburg's theory of causation, other researchers lost little time confirming the Warburg effect. Tumors did universally have the ability to grow without oxygen. By 1942, Dean Burke, B-U-R-K, at the National Cancer Center, or Cancer Institute, was able to report that this was true over 95% of the cancerous tissue he had examined. Then, in early 1950, Harry Goldblatt, Goldblatt, and Gladys Cameron at the Institute for Medical Research at Cedars at Lebanon Hospital in Los Angeles reported to a skeptical public that they had succeeded in transforming normal cells, that is, cultural fibroblasts from the heart of a 5-day-old rat to cancer cells merely by repeating depriving them of oxygen. So they're repeating the same thing that Warburg did earlier. In 1959, Paul Goldhaber gave further support to Warburg's hypothesis when he discovered that some types of millipore, P-O-R-O-E, diffusion chambers, but not others, when implanted under the skin of mice, cause large tumors to grow around them. Diffusion chambers were used to sample tissue fluid in many kinds of animal experiments. Their ability to cause cancer turned out to depend not on the type of plastic they were made of, but on the size of the pores that allowed fluid to flow through them. Only one animal out of 39 developed a tumor when the pores were 400 microns in diameter. But 9 out of 34 developed tumors when the pore size was 100 millicrons, and 16 out of 35, close to half, developed tumors when the pore size was only 50 millimicrons. The interference with free fluid circulation when the pore size was too small apparently deprived the tissues next to the chamber walls of oxygen. In 1967, Burke's team proved that the more malignant a tumor is, the higher its rate of glycosis, and the more glucose it consumes, and the more lactic acid it produces. Quote, the extreme forms of rapidly growing acidic cancer cells, in quote, Burke reported, quote, can produce lactic acid from glucose anaerobically at a sustained rate, probably faster than any other living mammal tissue, up to half the tissue dry weight per hour. Even a hummingbird, whose wings may beat up to at least 100 times a second, consumes at best only half its dry weight of glucose equivalent per day, end quote. Because he insisted that the origin of cancer was known, Warburg thought that, quote, one could prevent about 80% of all cancer if one could keep out the known carcinogen, end quote. He therefore advocated in 1954 for restrictions on cigarette smoking, pesticides, food additives, and air pollution by car exhaust. His incorporation of these attitudes into his personal life earned him a reputation as an eccentric. Long before environmentalism was popular, Warburg had a 1-acre organic garden, obtained milk from an organically maintained herd, and purchased French butter because in France, the use of herbicides and pesticides were more strictly controlled than in Germany. Otto Warburg passed away in 1970 at the age of 83, the same year the first oncogene was discovered. An oncogene is an abnormal gene thought to be caused by mutation that is associated with the development of cancer. The discovery of oncogenes and tumor suppressors genes promoted a widespread belief that cancer was caused by genetic mutation and not by altered metabolism. Warburg's hypothesis, controversially from the start, was largely abandoned for 3 decades. But the widespread use of PET scanning for diagnosis and staging human cancers had catapulted the Warburg effect back onto the main stage of cancer research. No one can now deny that cancer lives in an anaerobic environment and that they rely on anaerobic metabolism in order to grow. Even molecular biologists who once focused exclusively on the oncogene theory are discovering, after all, that there is a connection between lack of oxygen and cancer. A protein has been discovered that exists in all cells, hypos-induced factor, which is called HIF, that is activated under conditions of low oxygen, and that in turn activates many of the genes necessary for cancer growth. HIF activity has been found to be elevated in colon, breast, gastrus, lung, skin, esophagus, urine, ovarian, pancreas, the prostate, the renal, stomach, and brain cancers. Cellular changes that indicate damage to respiration included reduction in the number and size of microbiome, abnormal structures of microbiome, lessened activities of Krebs cycle enzymes, lessened activities of the electron transport chain, and mutations of microbiome genes are being routinely found in most types of cancer, even in tumors caused by viruses. One of the first signs of malignity is an increase in the rate of anaerobic metabolism. So experimentally inhibiting the respiration of cancer cells or simply depriving them of oxygen has been shown to alter the expression of hundreds of genes that are involved in malignant transformation and cancer growth. Damaging respiration makes cancer cells more invasive. Restoring normal respiration makes them less invasive. A consensus is forming among cancer researchers that is, tumors can only develop and cellular respiration is diminished. In 2009, a book dedicated to Otto Warburg was published titled, quote, Cellular Respiration and Carcinogenesis, end quote, addressing all aspects of this question and contained contributions from leading cancer researchers from the United States, Germany, France, Italy, Brazil, Japan, and Poland. In the foreword, Greg Semenska wrote, quote, Warburg invented a device now known as the Warburg manometer, manometer, which he demonstrated that tumor cells consume less oxygen and produce more lactate than do normal cells under the same ambient oxygen concentrations. A century later, the struggle to understand how and why metastatic cancer cells manifest the Warburg effect is still ongoing, and 12 rounds of this heavyweight fight await the reader beyond the brief introduction. The question being asked today by cancer researchers is no longer, is the Warburg effect real? But is hypoxia a cause or effect of cancer? That's HYPOXIA. But an increasingly many scientists are admitting it really doesn't matter, and may be only a question of semantics, since cancer cells thrive in the absence of oxygen. Oxygen deprivation gives insipid cancer cells a survival advantage, and any environmental factor that damages respiratory, therefore, whether Warburg was right and it directly causes malignant transformations, whether the skeptics are right and is merely provides an environment in which cancer has an advantage over normal cells, will necessarily increase the cancer rate. Electricity, as we have seen, is such a factor. Next section is called Diabetes and Cancer. In the same cause, a slowing metabolism by the electromagnetic fields around us produces both diabetes and cancers. Then one might expect diabetes to have a high rate of cancer and vice versa, and it is so. The first person to confirm a connection between the two diseases was South African physician George Darrett Manor in 1910. Unlike almost all other diseases, rates of both cancer and diabetes were steadily rising. Thinking that they might have a common cause, he analyzed mortality statistics from the 15 death registration states in 1900 Census of the United States. And he found, after correcting the population and age, that the two diseases were strongly related. States that had higher incidence of one also had higher incidence of the other. He proposed that electricity might be that common cause. And this is way back in 1910. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that no one probably listened to this guy from South Africa. Quote, only one cause, he seems to be, will fit the facts as we know them, viz. the presence of modern civilization and the strain of modern competition, or some factor closely associated with these. Radioactivity and various electrophenomena have from time to time been accused of producing cancer. The increased use of high-tension currents is an undoubtedly fact in modern city life, end quote. So we wait till another century later, and an acceptable fact that diabetes and cancer occur together. More than 160 epidemiological studies have investigated this question worldwide, and the majority have confirmed a link between the two diseases. Diabetes is more likely than non-diabetes to develop and to die from cancers of the liver, pancreas, kidney, the endometrium, colon, rectum, bladder, and breast, as well as non-Hodgkin lymphoma. In December 2009, the American Diabetes Association and American Cancer Society convened a joint conference. The consensus report that resulted concurred, quote, cancer and diabetes are diagnosed within the same individual more frequently than would be expected by chance, end quote. The next section is called Cancer in Animals. We recall from Chapter 11 that the complete autopsy records of the Philadelphia Zoo, kept since 1901, showed an increase in heart disease that accelerated during the 1930s and 40s, and it affected all species of animals and birds at the zoo. An equivalent increase occurred in rates of cancer. 1959, a report from the Penrose Research Laboratory at the zoo divided the autopsies in two time periods, 1901 to 1934, and then from 1935 to 1955. The rate of malignant tumors among 9 families of mammals increased between 2 and 20-fold from the earlier to the latter time period. The rate of benign tumors increased even more. Only 3% of felines, for example, had benign or malignant tumors at autopsy during the earlier period, compared to 18.1% during the latter period. The 7.8% of bears had tumors during the earlier period, compared to 47% during the latter period. The autopsy records of 7,286 birds at the zoo, encompassing 4 different orders, showed that malignant tumors increased 2.5-fold and benign tumors 8-fold. Vital statistics. The real story, again, is revealed by the historical records. The increase in cancer began slightly before heart disease and diabetes began to rise. Early records from England show that cancer deaths were rising as early as 1850. Okay, so these are statistics, and I'll go into this here. So this is based upon cancer deaths in England per 100,000 population. So in 1840, it was 17.7. In 1870, another 30 years later, is 42.4. So it's not decreasing here. It's actually already double. By the year 1900, it's now 82.8. It's now double again, almost 83%. 83, that is 83 people, I should say. As it continues on, actually that stops. Well, it's 1905 is the last number they did. This is 88.5, which was originally 17.7 per 100,000 population. Cook and Wheatstone first telegraph line running from London to West Drayton opened for business as July 9, in 1839. By 1850, over 2,000 miles of wire ran the length and breadth of England. While we don't have earlier statistics from England to prove that cancer rates first began rising between 1840 and 1850, or comparable data from any other national government, we do have them for the parish of Firstenberg, a small, well-to-do rural district 90 miles west of Stockholm, Sweden. We have them because in 1902, Swedish physician Adolf L. in an effort to discover whether cancer rates had really risen during the previous century, consulted the, quote, the death and burial book, end quote, kept by the clergy of Firstenberg parish. This is based upon a church. These are the numbers that he compiled from the book. So, we're starting in 1801 to 1810, there were 2.1 people had cancer and died by for 100,000. So they got these for 10 years. They got them for all the way up to 1895 to 1900. So let's get to the brass here, folks. By 1851 and 1860, it was 14. But that transcended with 40 years later, 35, I should say, from 1895 to 1900 was almost a tenfold increase from 140. It was from 14 to 141.0. The records were incomplete from 1863 and 1884, but the records that was 5 tell the story that we see. The population in Firstenberg was 4,608 at the beginning of the 19th century. At the end of it, it was 7,104. One person died of cancer about every 3 years between 1801 and 1850. Then in 1853, the first telegram wires in Sweden was strung between Stockholm, the capital, and Uppsala, I should say, a city of 37 miles north. The following year, a line was run southwestward from Uppsala via Västerås to Örebro. This line ran right through the middle of Firstenberg parish. At that time, the cancer rate in Firstenberg began to rise. By the turn of the 20th century, the country folk in Firstenberg were dying of cancer faster than the average residents of London. So in 1900, annual cancer deaths around the world per 100,000 population were, we're going to look at these, and this is remarkable in a lot of ways, so it might have a connection. The worst was Switzerland. 127 people died in 1900, cancer, per 100,000 people. The rates dropped from then. You have Holland at 92, England and Wales at 83, Bermuda at 75, Germany at 72, the United States was 64, Ireland at 61, Italy, 52, Japan at 39. I'm sorry, it's 46, I should say. They're all decreased from there. The lowest rates are in Jamaica, St. Kitts, Trinidad, and Mauritius. This is kind of important because Dr. Bill McGraw talks about some of these areas, especially what he calls blue zones. And those are certain areas where people eat certain foods that are different than most people. Those tend to be what we call small areas of the world. And I can't remember what. Another one is actually in Okinawa. Another one was actually in some part of Italy, in the southern part of it. And there is one, I think, in the Western Hemisphere. I think it's actually, there are two. I think I remember one of the islands in the Caribbean, and I think it was someplace off the California coast or either in that vicinity. But don't quote me on that, okay? So I continue here. So I'm seeing certain things like Guatemala was only 4. Bahamas was 1.8. Fiji was 1.7. Then he talks about New Guinea, which is basically north of Australia, Borneo, Java, Sumatra, Philippines, and most of Africa and macro were non-existent. Well, that's because they didn't have the wires running all over, electricity. Every historical source shows that cancer always accompanied electricity. In 1914, among about 63,000 American Indians living on reservations, none of which had electricity, there was only 2 deaths from cancer. Okay? So they're saying out of 63,000 people living in reservations, none of which had electricity, there were only 2 deaths from cancer in 1914. The cancer mortality in the United States as a whole was 25 times as high. So that's a key factor here, okay? And he has, folks, on this book here, he has over 100 pages of footnotes. These are all footnotes. He puts numbers here. I could tell you these things, but it would take me all day, all night. An unusual one-year rise in cancer mortality from 3 to 10% occurred in every modernized country in 1920 and 1921. This corresponds to the beginning of commercial AM radio broadcasting. At one time, let me tell you a little history. This is not in the book, but in the history of radio, there were several stations. I think one was in Cincinnati or Cleveland. And these were started by, I think, RCA, Western Electric, or somewhere of that nature. These were the big players, and they had the money to actually start this. But they were broadcasting far more at one time than what they do even today. 50,000 watt is I think is the largest you can have in FM radio. Now, I don't know if FM radio is part of that. But AM radio was a lot more because they could broadcast, and there was no you picked out a station, let's say 870 out of New York. Okay, I think it's WCBS. AM. Okay, so AM radio. Okay, when you started out long ago in the 1920s, there was no one on that particular kilohertz or kilowatts, as they call it back then. Okay, so 870 had its all alone. There was no frequency, no other station, I should say, on that frequency. Okay, so it could actually shoot a signal, 50,000 watts or 100,000 watts, and it could be heard on a shortwave radio set in people's homes, run by batteries at that time. There was certain places, and I know this because my dad told me someplace they had radio that was batteries. There were large batteries, such and such. At that time, there was no electricity out to that area. In fact, the radios were sold at that time to be able to run off of batteries at that point, because a lot of people in rural areas didn't have electricity. There's again the whole factor here. At one time, in Mexico, there was a station with Wolfman Jack. I don't know if anybody knows about that. I think it's called Zerta, Xerta. And it was shooting out 500,000 watts. At that time, you could do that in Mexico. You could hear the station. And I don't recall. It was on an AM deal. Wolfman Jack would be on that station broadcasting back in I think in the 70s, maybe the 80s. Anyway, that stopped eventually. They were no longer allowed to do that much. So let's go back to what I was saying here. So in 1920, cancer death rose 8% in Norway, 7% in South Africa and France, 5% in Sweden, 4% in the Netherlands, and 3% in the United States. But in 1921, cancer deaths rose 10%, that is, in Portugal. Again, all the other countries, 5%. And then lung cancer and breast cancer and prostate cancer rose spectacularly throughout the first half of the 20th century in every country for which we have good data. The number of deaths from breast cancer quintupled in Norway, sextuple in the Netherlands, and increased 17-fold in the United States. This is about lung cancer, breast cancer, and prostate cancer. Lung cancer deaths increased 20-fold in England. Prostate cancer deaths increased 11-fold in Switzerland, and 12-fold in Australia, and 13-fold in England. Now, is this occurring during the war? This is after the war. So this is after the 1920s. But AM radio is being built. You see, this is a way of people finding out information. Lung cancer was once so uncommon that it was not even listed separately in most countries until 1929. In a few countries that tracked it, it did not start the dramatic rise until about 1920. A gentleman named Benjamin Ward Richardson, in his 1876 book, Diseases of Modern Life, is surprisingly to a modern reader in this respect. His chapter on, quote, cancer from smoking, end quote, discusses the controversy over whether tobacco smoking causes cancer of the lip, tongue, or throat, but cancer of the lung is not even mentioned. Remember, let's think about this. Were these cigarettes back then, were they commercially made? Okay, that's another speculation. In other words, Indians smoked tobacco. They smoked the tobacco. They rolled it themselves, you see. And they smoked it much earlier. So lung cancer was still rare in 1913, the year when the American Society for Control of Cancer was founded. Interesting. Out of 2,641 cases of cancer reported to the New York State Institute for the Study of Malignant Diseases that year, there was only a single case of primary lung cancer. Frederick Hoffman, in his 1915 book, The Mortality from cancer throughout the world, asserted as a proven fact that smoking caused cancer of the lips, mouth, and throat. But, like Richardson for decades previously, made no mention of lung cancer in connection with smoking. Swedish researchers Arjane Hallberg and Ole Johansson have shown that the rates of lung, breast, and prostate cancer continue to rise just as spectacular in the second half of the 20th century in 40 countries, along with malignant melanoma and cancers of the bladder and colon, and that the overall rate of cancer changed precisely with changes in the exposure of populations to radio waves. The rate of increase in cancer deaths in Sweden accelerated in 1920, 1955, and 1969, and took a downturn in 1978. In 1920, we got AM radio. In 1955, we got FM radio and TV1. In 1969 and 70, we got TV2 and color TV. In 1978, several of the old AM broadcasting transmitters were disrupted. End quote. That none in their article. Quote, cancer trends during the 20th century. End quote. Their data suggests that at least as many cases of lung cancer can be attributed to radio waves as to smoking. So I'm going back here. FM radio did not become very popular as I'm a kid till probably the late 70s when they began to pull away from AM and FM because FM had a better, quote unquote, stereo sound, okay, unlike AM, which was not stereo. The same articles have focused on FM radio exposure in connection with malignant melanoma, following up the findings at Helen Dock at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. In 1995, Dock and her colleagues have shown that the incidence of skin melanoma declined with distance from the powerful television and FM radio transmitters at Sutton Coalfield in the Western Midlands of England, noting that the FM frequency ranges are 85 to 108 kilohertz. Is close to the resonant frequency of the human body. I didn't know that. Hallberg and Johansson decided to complete melanoma incidence with exposure to FM radio waves for all 565 Swedish counties. The results were startling. When melanoma incidence is plotted on a graph against the average number of FM transmitters to which a city is exposed, the points fall on a straight line. Counties that get reception from 4.5 FM stations have a rate of malignant melanoma that is 11 times as high as counties that do not get reception from any FM station. So here's the key. Let me explain this. AM is different than FM. FM works on a line of sight. So once you get to what we call, when there's becomes what I call a mountainous area, or the topography changes, FM signals are almost impossible to receive. Okay, so I can remember as a kid in 1970s, mid 70s, coming to Aiken, where I live at now, but we could still hear the station out of Charlotte, North Carolina, which was a FM station. And we had a nice stereo, as I would say, FM radio in the car. And about 20 miles or 15 miles away, that is away from Aiken, the signal began to dissipate. That's how far it would go. AM is completely different, folks. AM is directional, but it's not only that. AM radio itself it's different. It doesn't work by line of sight. Usually, I can explain shortwave, which is where they shoot the frequency up to the ionosphere and it bounces back many thousands of miles. That's why shortwave is frequently used by major countries to report news to foreign listeners. And that's why even Christian broadcasting is enormously popular on shortwave, because they can shoot signals and beam those signals to a particular area where they want to shoot those signals to a particular audience. That's the difference. But AM simply is, depending on their radio directions, can beam their stations far, far longer than FM. Usually FM can only go, depending on how many thousands of watts, usually it's only about 50 miles. It depends on the power, what they're using. Obviously, the station I listened to was a station called WSOC in Charlotte. And I remember simply that distinctly. We would have that on the station. We listened to while I was riding. And guess what? We could hear the station briefly, like I said, till we get about 15, 20 miles from Aiken, and the signal began to dissipate. Anyway, in their article, Malignant Melanoma of the Skin, Not a Sunshine Story, they refute the notion that the tremendous increase in this disease since 1955 is caused primarily by the sun. No increases in ultraviolet radiation due to ozone depletion occurred as early as 1955, nor until the 1960s. Did Swedes begin to travel to more southerly countries in large numbers to soak up the sun? The embarrassing truth is that rates of melanoma on the head and feet hardly rose at all between 1955 and 2008, while rates for sun-protected areas of the middle of the body increased by a factor of 20. Most moles and melanomas are now occurring not on the head, arms, and feet, but in areas of the body that are not exposed to sunshine. Interesting. And he shows where these dots are. There are noticeably on male and females. It's usually where there are some on your legs, but most of them are also in your torso area, pretty much down to your sexual organs, and that's it. And then they're much higher there, and it's on the front and back. Okay. This was done in 2002. This deal. So Elihu Richeter in Israel has recently published a report on 47 patients treated at Hebrew University Hadash School of Medicine who developed cancer after occupational exposure to high levels of electromagnetic fields and or radio waves. So this electromagnetic fields means simply working on power lines, okay, or working near radio stations or in radio stations or working on the antenna itself. And you got to understand, folks, many of those people who actually climb those antennas, actually that signal is going through while they're there on top, okay, while they're going up, walking up there. Many of these people, especially the youngest people, develop their cancers within a surprisingly short period of time. Some as short as 5 to 6 months after the beginning of their exposure. This dispels the notion that we must wait 10 or 20 years to see the effects of cell phones in the world population. Richter's team warns that, quote, with the recent introduction of Wi-Fi into schools, personal computers for each pupil in many schools, high-frequency voltage transit measures in schools, as well as the population wide use of cell phones, cordless phones, some exposure to cell phone towers, residential exposure to RF/MW from smart meters and other smart electronic equipment at the home, and possibly also ELF, exposure to high-power generators and transformers. Young people are no longer free from exposure to EMF, end quote. The range of tumors in Richter's clinic ran the gamut. Leukemia, lymphomas, and cancers of the brain, rectum, colon, testes, bone, peritoneal gland, breast, skin, vertebrate column, lung, liver, kidney, pituitary gland, pineal gland, prostate, and cheek muscles. So he gives a statistic here also based upon cancer deaths per 100,000 based in the United States at 10.3 in 1850. By 1900 is 60. By 1950 is double that, 139.8, so let's just say 140. By 1970 is 162.8, so it's 163. By 2000, and its highest peak here was at 203.2 in 1990. It's dropped somewhat. 2000 was 200.9, and then 185, and the last one was 183.9 in 2017. Figures 5 and 6 show the same linear correspondence between cancer and electrification in the 48 United States in 1931 and 1940 have already been shown for heart disease and diabetes. Again, this is a graph that shows this whole thing. Again, the states that had what I call the rural communities and had very little quote-unquote electrification because they were rural, mostly these states were rural. And I'm just very clear. They're very low in New Mexico, South Carolina again, Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi. Okay, but the ones at the top are, guess what? The same ones: Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Maine, okay, and Connecticut. Those are the highest one on that stream and the lowest. So this tells you a lot, okay? Again, this is rate of rural cancer in 1931, table 4. And we won't go all through this. I want, because I'm wanting to get through this, so I don't want to go. But this is the whole deal. This shows over and over again, basically the states that got the last, that's why they're called rural electric co-ops in South Carolina. They're electric cooperatives that were given money by the government to put up power lines in the rural part of the states. The big power companies did not want to do that. They didn't want to spend their money towards people that basically, they're only 5 people per mile. 5 people per mile, I should say. They're not going to waste their money doing that, you see, because that's, wow, that's a lot of money for, for 5 people. Okay, what's the point? And I'm just making an illustration. It's not 5 people. It would be probably, 25 people, maybe the max. But the point is, they were not going to spend thousands and thousands of dollars to put in electrification in those areas for 25 people. It didn't make any sense. And then when the problem is simply, they're not on straight lines neither. They live all in different areas and counties, in the country. So guess what? You would have to run that power line to a certain area, then you have to run it to their individual house. That's asinine. Why would you want to spend all that kind of money? Because you'll never recoup that money, you see. You may notice that the position of Nevada shifted more than any other state between 1931 and 1940. For some reasons, death from heart disease, diabetes, and cancer rose dramatically in Nevada, while the rate of household electrification rose only modestly. I proposed that the construction of Hoover Dam, which was completed in 1936, was that reason. The most powerful hydroelectric plant in the world at that time. Its 1 billion watt capacity supplied not only Las Vegas, not only Los Angeles, and most of Southern California via high voltage power lines that course through southeastern Nevada on their way to the destinations, exposing the surrounding areas where most of the population of the state lived, in some of the world's highest levels of electromagnetic fields. In June of 1939, the Los Angeles grid was connected to Hoover Dam via a 287,000 volt transmission line, also the most powerful in the world at that time. And these are huge things. You can see them. You see them, they look like they're all made out of aluminum, and they hold these wires. 2 types of cancer deserves additional comment: lung cancer and brain cancer. As the following graph shows, the percentage of adults who smoke has declined steadily since 1970 among both men and women. Yet lung cancer mortality has almost quadrupled in women. It is virtually the same in men as it was 50 years ago. Okay? They show a graph of that also. When non-smoking, that is Dana Reeve, the 46-year-old widow of Superman actor Christopher Reeve, died of lung cancer in 2006, the public was stunned because we had had it drummed into us for decades that this type of cancer is caused by smoking. Yet lung cancer in people who have never smoked, if you consider it as a separate category, ranks today as the 7th most common cause of cancer deaths worldwide, even before the cancer of cervix, or pancreas, and prostate. So those that don't even smoke are getting cancer now. So you cannot connect that, which is sometimes I've always thought they were connected, because it still is. Don't get me wrong. Cancer is cancer. If you smoke, you're going to have a greater chance of getting cancer. Period. That's a fact. But now those who don't smoke are now the ones who are actually having the same issue. Brain tumors deserve mention because obviously of cell phones. Several billion people in the world are exposing their brain for up to 2 hours per day, 10 hours per day to microwave radiation at point blank range. A new situation that began in approximately 1996 and 1997 in most countries. Yet, honest data on brain tumors are difficult to attain because special interest has controlled most of the research funding on brain tumors since the advent of digital cell phones 2 decades ago. I wonder why. As a result, a media war has pitted the independent scientists who report a tripling to quadrupling of brain cancer rates among those who have used their cell phones for the 10 years or more. Against industry scientists who report no increase in cancer at all. The problem, as Australian neurosurgeon Charlie, that is Teo, tells those who will listen, is that all the data on cell phone users comes from data banks controlled by cell phone providers. And no telcos have allowed, these companies are not going to allow scientists to assess their records for those large studies, end quote. I found out firsthand how closely not only the telecom providers, but the scientists they fund guard their data. When I requested access to some of it in 2006, yet another industry-funded study was published, this time in Denmark, purporting to show not only that cell phones did not cause brain cancer, but that cell phones usually even had a lower rate of brain cancer than anyone else. Yeah, sure. In other words, those scientists would have the world believe that people might actually protect themselves from brain tumors by holding a cell phone to their head for hours per day. The study, published in the Journal of National Cancer Institute, was titled, quote, Cellular Telephone Uses in Cancer Risk, Update of the Nationwide Danish Cohort, end quote. It claimed to come to its conclusions after an examination of the medical records of over 420,000 Danish cell phone users. So this is people who are in Denmark. And non-users over a period of 2 decades. It was clear to me that something was wrong with the statistics. Although the study found a lower rate of brain cancer in men only among cell phone users than non-users, it found a higher rate of exactly those cancers that Swedish scientists Hallberg and Johansson had reported to be caused by radio waves: bladder cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, and prostate cancer. The Danish study did not report rates of colon cancer or melanoma, the other 2 types of cancer that the Swedish researchers had mentioned. However, the Danish study did additionally find that testicular cancer in men was higher, and cervical and kidney cancer in women were significantly higher among the cell phone users. I sensed manipulation of the data because the only type of cancer for which a, quote, protected, end quote, effect was reported was the type of cancer these scientists and their funders were trying to convince the public that cell phones did not cause brain cancer. So what they're trying to say is simply, we'll give you the data on the lower parts of your body where you don't put your phone in, okay? All right, that's what they're doing. It occurred to me that all the study subjects had actually been using cell phones for a long time, by the year 2004 when the study ended. The only difference between users and non-users was the date of first subscriptions. The users first bought a cell phone between 1982 and 1995, while the non-users didn't buy one until after 1995, and all the, quote, users, end quote, were lumped together. See, you can't do that. The study did not distinguish between people who had used cell phones for 9 years and people who had used them for 22 years. But according to the study, those who subscribed prior to 1995 tended to be wealthier, drank, and smoked much less than those who first subscribed later. Well, that's just saying simply that people could afford them. That's what they're saying. I suspected that controlling for length of use might change the results of the study. So I did a natural, normal, accepted thing that scientists do when they wish to validate a study that is published in a peer-reviewed journal. I requested a look at their data. On December 18, 2006, I sent an email to the lead author, Joachim Schulz, tell him that I had colleagues in Denver who would like to look at their data. And on January 19, 2007, we were accordingly refused permission. The letter of refusal was signed by 3 of the study's 6 authors. That is Joachim Schulz, Christopher Johansson, and Jorgen H. Olsen. Meanwhile, Theo is sounding alarm. This is a guy in Australia. I see 10 to 20 new patients each week, he says, and at least 1/3 of these patients' tumors are in the area of the brain around the ear. As a neurosurgeon, I cannot ignore this fact. Now, it's only one person, but he's pretty much to the point. This is a guy in Australia again, talking about this information earlier. Many, if not most of us, have one or more acquaintances or family members who have or have died from a brain tumor. My friend Noel Kaufman, who died in 2012 at the age of 46, never used a cell phone, but he did use a home cordless phone for years, which emits the same type of radiation. That's something I didn't really realize until about a year ago. The ones you used to have, you could pick up and you take it to your room or whatever, They had this little antenna on it. Guess what? It's no better. Okay. Which emits the same type of radiation, and the tumor that killed him was in the part of the brain beneath the ear against which he held that phone. All of us have heard about famous people who have died of brain tumors, like Senator Ted Kennedy, Attorney Johannes Kochman, journalist Robert Novak, Vice President Joe Biden's son, though I have in my files sent to me by the director of the California Brain Tumor Association a list of over 300 celebrities who either have a brain tumor or have died from one during the past decade and a half. When I was younger, I never heard of any celebrity who had brain cancer. Yet highly publicized studies assure us that brain tumor rates are not increasing. This is certainly not true, and a little investigation shows why. The data cannot be trusted in the United States or anywhere else. In 2007, researchers at the Swedish National Board of Health and Welfare found out that, for some reason, 1/3 of the cases of brain cancer diagnosed at university hospitals and the majority of cases at county hospitals were not being reported to the Swedish Cancer Registry. All other types of cancer were being routinely reported, but not brain cancer. So they don't want to show this because in reality it's probably way high. Anyway, a 1994 study revealed that difficulties in brain cancer reporting were already occurring in Finland, although the Finnish cancer register was complete for most types of cancer. It's seriously underreported brain tumors again. Here in the United States, a severe problem has been found with surveillance, not just of brain cancer, but across the board. The SEER, the Surveillance, Epidemiology, and End Results program run by the National Cancer Institute, wonder why, depend on state registers to deliver accurate data, but the data are not accurate. American researchers David Harris reported at a conference in Berlin in 2008 that state registers cannot keep up with the increasing load of cancer cases because they are not receiving enough funding to do so. SEER registers are currently faced with the challenge of collecting more cases in less time with often the same limited resources as the previous year. He said, this means that the greater the rise of cancer, the less it will be reported, barring an improvement in the American economy. Even worse has been the deliberate refusal by Veterans Administration hospitals and military-based medical facilities to report cases of the state cancer registers. It's all being hidden now. A report by Brian Furlow that appears in the Lancet Oncology in 2007 noted, quote, a precipitous decline in VA reporting of new cases in California. Cancer registers began in late 2004 from 3,000 cases in 2003 to almost none by the end of 2005, end quote. So they're hiding it. After inquiring in other states, Furlow discovered that California was not an exception. The Florida Cancer Register has never received any VA case reports, and VA facilities in other states were dealing with years of backlog, unreported cancer cases. Quote, we've been working with the VA for more than 5 years, but it just got worse, end quote. Holly Howell told him she represents the North American Association of Center Cancer Registers. As many as 70,000 cases of cancer from the VA were not being reported each year. And in 2007, the VA made non-reporting official policy when it issued a directive on cancer, nullifying all existing agreements between state registers and VA facilities. So they're not even reporting it. They're not even saying it. That's what he's saying. What she's saying. Furlow reported that the Department of Defense was also not cooperating with the cancer registers. No cancer diagnosis at military-based facilities has been reported to any state register for several years. As a result of all these failures, Dennis Deppun, the Los Angeles Cancer Surveillance Program, warned that studies based on the deficient data may be worthless. Quote, researchers from the mid-2000s will forever require an asterisk or perhaps a sticker on the cover to remind researchers and the public that they are not correct, end quote, he said. Director of Doctors at the Southern Alberta Cancer Research Institute at the University of Calgary were shocked when records showed a 30% increase in malignant brain tumors in Calgary in the single year between 2012 and 2013. Despite official government statistics proclaiming no rise in malignant brain tumors rates at all in either the province of Alberta or the nation of Canada. This discrepancy has lit a fire under Faith Davis, professor of epidemiology at the University of Alberta School of Public Health. As unreliable as official statistics are for malignant tumors, they are even worse for non-malignant tumors. So we have people now who's what he's saying is people that are working for the government or whoever, private hospitals or whatever, they're not reporting the truth. They're not giving out any information. Canada's surveillance system does not record them at all. So somebody's been bought out, and somebody's been bought off, I should say. To remedy this incredible situation, the Brain Tumor Foundation of Canada announced in July 2015 that it is raising money to help Davis create a national brain tumor register that will finally give clinics and researchers access to accurate information. The studies that are assuring us that all is well with cell phones have been funded by the telecommunication industry. No surprise there. But in spite of severe underreporting of brain tumors, independent scientists are confirming the impression of brain surgeons and oncologists that there are caseloads are increasing, as well as the evident fact that many more people that we know and hear about are dying of such tumors than ever before. The most prominent of these independent scientists is Leonard Hardell, that's spelled L-E-N-N-A-R-T, Hardell, H-A-R-D-E-L-L. Hardell is a professor of oncology and cancer epidemiology at University Hospital in Örebro, Sweden. Although most of his earlier research was on chemicals like dioxins, PCBs, and flame retardants, and herbicides since 1999, he is focused on exposure to cell and cordless phones. He tells us, based on case-controlled studies involving over 1,250 people with malignant brain tumors, that using both cell phones and cordless phones significantly increases one risk for brain cancer. The more years you use such a phone, the more cumulative hours you use one. And the younger you are at first exposure, the greater the odds that you will develop a tumor. 2,000 hours of cell phone use, according to Hardell. I'm going to say that again. 2,000 hours of cell phone use, according to Hardell, triples one's risk. That's 3 times, folks. Okay. So how many 2,000? Okay, let's say you stay on the phone for 2 hours a day. Okay, all right. 2 times 7 is 14. 14 times 28. 28 times 2 is 56. So let's say 56 hours. All right, let me look at this here. So 56 hours per month. Okay, so if 56 hours per month, what would that be? Let's see real quick here. 56 times 12 is 672 hours a year. So they're saying 2,000 hours. So that's a third of that. First use of cell phones before the age of 20 increases one's overall risk of brain cancer threefold. Risk of a most common type of malignant brain tumor fivefold, and the risk of a astrocytoma on the same side of the head as the phone eightfold. First use of cordless phones began the age before the age of 20 doubles the risk of any brain tumor, quadruples the rise of astrocytoma, and increase the risk of astrocytoma on the same side of the head eightfold. The literature on cell towers and radio towers is less compromised. Almost all existing studies until recently have been funded by the independent sources and not by telecommunication industry, and they have yielded consistent results. Living near a transmission tower is carcinogenic. Okay? That's why you don't want them in your neighborhood. William Morton at Oregon Health Science University found that living near VHF TV broadcast antennas was a significant risk for leukemia and breast cancer in the Portland, Vancouver metropolis area from 1967 to 1982. In 1986, the Department of Health of the State of Hawaii found that residents of Honolulu who lived in census tracts that had one or more broadcast towers had a 43% increased risk for all types of cancer. Back to Bruce Hawkins, in 1996, an occupational physician in Melbourne analyzed the childhood cancer incidence for 9 Australian municipals in relation to a group of 3 high-powered television towers. Children who lived closer than 4 kilometers to the towers were almost 2.5 times more likely to die of leukemia as children in more distant cities. In 1997, Helen Dock and her colleagues found high rates of adult leukemia, bladder cancer, and skin melanoma near the Sutton Coalfield Tower on the northern edge of Birmingham, when Dalton expanded her study to include 20 high-powered transmission towers throughout Great Britain. She found that in general, the closer you lived to a tower, the more likely you were to have leukemia. In 2000, Neil Cherry analyzed the childhood cancer rate in San Francisco as a function of distance from Sutro SUTRO tower. Sutro Tower is almost 1,000 feet tall. It stands on top of a tall hill and can be seen from all over San Francisco. At the time when Cherry studied, it was broadcasting nearly 1 million watts of VHF TV, which is very high frequency TV, and FM radio signals, plus over 18 million watts of UHF, which is ultra high frequency TV. So the VHF signals from basically from, I think it's from channel 2 all the way up to channel, I don't know, 20? I don't know if it's even that high. That's VHF. UHF is basically like from 18 all the way up, 54, whatever. You have all these numbers, 26, whatever. The rates of brain cancer, lymphoma, leukemia, and all cancers combined throughout San Francisco were related to the distance a child lived from the tower. Children who lived on hills and ridgetops had much more cancer than children who were living in valleys and were shielded from the towers. Children who lived less than 1 kilometer from the towers had 9 times the rate of leukemia, 15 times the rate of lymphoma, 31 times the rate of brain cancer, and 18 times the total cancer rate as children in the rest of the city. In 2004, Ronnie and Danny Wolf responded to residents in a small neighborhood around a single-cell tower in South Netanya in Israel. During the 5 years before the tower was erected, 2 of the 622 residents had developed cancer. During the single year after the tower went up, 8 more developed cancer. This turned a neighborhood with one of the lowest cancer rates in the city into a zone where the risk was more than quadruple the average for Netanya. In the same year, Horst Egger, a physician in Nala, Germany, examined 1,000 patients' records in his hometown. He found that people who live within 400 meters, that is only 1,300 feet, of a cell tower had triple the risk of developing cancer, and developed their cancer on average when they were 8 years younger compared to people who live further away. In 2011, Adisla Dode, headed up a team of university students and government officials at the metropolis in southeastern Brazil that confirmed the results of all the previous studies. The risk of cancer for the residents of Belo Horizonte decreased uniformly and steadily with distance from a cell tower. And on February 24, 2011, the Supreme Court of Italy upheld the 2000 conviction of Cardinal Tussi for polluting Rome with radio waves. A 10-day suspension jail sentence was his only punishment. Wowee. No one has ever been compensated for their injuries. The prosecutor's office has not filed charges of negligible homicide. Vatican radio antennas have not been shut down. So much for that. Really sad. Okay, that's the end of chapter 13. Okay, thank you for being here. I'm learning a lot. I hope that you are aware of these things. If not, you need to be aware of them. And you need to understand that you have a phone given to your child is not a very good time. Not a very good thing to do. Seriously. Do you understand? You understand what you're doing? Okay. Okay. Because you're causing damage to your very child. Okay. I know the state of South Carolina is actually beginning to move, trying to get students not to have phones in their classroom. Another problem. We're talking about phones, folks, in classrooms. Okay. For children, children, schools. Okay. And there's an issue simply as well, they need to have these phones. No, they don't. No, they don't. Sorry, folks. Don't. Okay. If you have an issue, you just go to the phone system, that is, in the library or whatever, and call for help. Or, my point simply is the phone has become so personified that people will not give it up, which is scary. Okay. All right. Thank you very much again for listening. Have a good night. Take care. Bye-bye.